I guess you take the jobs you get when your resume reads like a half-hearted apology. A scattering of short stints in retail, a summer flipping burgers, and a vague attempt at freelancing that involved more coffee shop visits than actual work. So, answering an ad for a caretaker at an old lighthouse didn't seem the worst way to spend a few months. Isolation, sure. Weirdness, likely. But how bad could it be? The drive down to the coast was a spiral into less and less civilization. By the time my rattling old hatchback coughed onto the gravel lot, the sea was a gray torment, and the lighthouse loomed like an admonishing finger. It had the tumble-down charm of neglect, all weathered stone and salt-scarred wood, standing solitary against the skyline. The welcome committee was a man named Keith, a rake-thin streak of salt and pepper hair, looking like he'd weathered more storms than the lighthouse itself. His handshake was a formality, brief and sandpapery. "Guess you found the place all right," he said, eyes flicking past me as if expecting a convoy. I nodded, pulling my jacket tighter against the biting wind. "Yeah, GPS died about 20 miles back, but hard to miss this." I gestured vaguely at the bleak panorama. Keith grunted, a sound that seemed to come from his boots, and turned towards the building. "Let's get you settled then." Inside was colder than outside, which was the first tick in the not right column. Houses, or any building really, had no good reason to be colder inside. The air tasted old, salty, and tinged with something metallic I couldn't quite place. The ground floor was one large room, dust veils dancing over sparse, outdated furniture, as if they were trying to escape. An ancient radio sat on the mantel, static humming softly through its speakers, disrupting the silence occasionally when it felt like it. Keith handed me a set of keys on a large, rusted keyring. "Not many doors to open, but better you have these." He then produced a crumpled piece of paper from his coat. "The rules," he said, tapping the paper. "Nothing outrageous. Read them, learn them. They're important for a place like this." The first rule was simple: always lock the door leading to the top of the lighthouse after sunset. No exceptions. This seemed reasonable, if a bit paranoid. The second was more peculiar: do not, under any circumstances, interfere with the wildlife around the lighthouse. I shrugged internally. I wasn't a birdwatcher or anything, so no problem there. The third made me pause. Avoid the radio between 2:13 p.m. and 3:29 p.m. every day. It interferes with essential frequencies. Oddly specific times and what frequencies were out here in the void. But it was the fourth rule that really sent the first real shiver across my skin. Do not attempt to look into the light from below between midnight and dawn. It wasn't just the rule, but the way Keith said it, like an insistent whisper clawing at the back of my mind. "Any questions?" Keith asked, pulling his coat collar up as he prepared to leave. "Yeah," I said, my voice steady, although my instincts screamed *run. "What's with the radio and the light thing?" Keith's eyes narrowed slightly. "Rules are there for a reason. Sometimes understanding them is not as important as following them." Not the most satisfying answer. After Keith left, the lighthouse felt immediately emptier, like it sighed him out and was left hollow. Hungry, I thought, and chastised myself for letting imagination overrun reason. I put away some meager groceries in the nearly ancient refrigerator, the chill inside it competing with that of the rooms. As evening approached, the wind outside turned into a low moan, weaving through the lighthouse as if speaking in tongues to unseen spirits. I kept glancing at the old radio, half expecting it to burst into life with more than just static. Then, sitting alone in the semi-darkness, I first heard it, a soft, guttural growl, eerily like a warning, coming not from the shadows around me, but from under the floorboards, from the very foundations of the lighthouse itself. For an uneasy moment, I quelled the urge to flee, my breath suspended in a tight clutch within my chest. The growl rumbled again, louder this time, as if the very stones of the foundation were vibrating with restrained fury. The thin hairs on my arms stood at attention, and a cold, prickling sensation crawled up my spine. Fear, harsh and raw, lit fires in the pit of my stomach. I should have moved, screamed, done something. But instead, I sat frozen, gazes pinned to the wooden floor as if the very boards might tear apart and reveal the horrors beneath. The lighthouse had stood here for over a century, overlooking waves that crashed against the rocky promontory with relentless persistence. I had thought it merely an isolated, albeit starkly beautiful place to clear my head, to escape the suffocating city air. What stories lay buried in its belly? What secret? It kept hoarded beneath its stoic beam, I hadn't dared ponder until now. Slowly, painfully slow, I reached beside me for the flashlight I had carelessly tossed aside earlier. My fingers fumbled, brushing against the cold metal, and I snatched it up with a sharp intake of breath, as though the sound alone could summon whatever lurked below. Still, nothing broke the surface, only that abominable growling, now mingled with the creaking of the old wooden floor, a symphony of dread. I flicked the flashlight on, the beam trembling in my unsteady grip. Light pierced the dimness of the room, casting long, eerie shadows against the walls. I was afraid, no, terrified, to lay the beam directly on the floor to illuminate whatever creature might be watching from below. Instead, my light darted around the circular room, over the antiquated radio equipment, the maps yellowed with age, the steep staircase spiraling upward where no comfort waited. The growl intensified, now accompanied by a scratching sound. Sharp, insistent, like claws against wood. My mouth felt dry, my throat tightening as if choked by invisible hands. In a moment of desperate courage or madness, I aimed the flashlight downward, my hand shaking violently. There, in the gaps between the floorboards, something moved, shadowy, formless, too quick to discern. My heart leapt into my throat, throttling any scream. It was there, something alive, something aware of me, something not meant to dwell in the habitation of men. In my frozen state, I noticed other things, the subtle signs of habitation I had initially dismissed. The slightly misplaced objects, the faint odors of decay masked by the salt air, the recent marks of disturbance. Someone or something had been here recently, using this place, living here, waiting. A louder scratch, more insistent than before, snapped me from my observations. It was as if whatever resided below was growing impatient, hungry for interaction, or perhaps for me. My mind raced, horror scenarios flicking through like the frames of a grotesque film. I needed to move, needed to escape, but where would I go? Out into the storm that enveloped the lighthouse in a relentless siege? Or up the rickety stairs to what probably was not sanctuary, but another trap? I stood up, barely noticing my knees wobble. The growl followed, seeming to track my rise, the source of the sound perceptibly closer to the slats beneath my feet. The scratches turned to thuds, heavy and dull, like the beat of a heart or the pounding of a warning. Moving instinctively, I stepped backward, away from the emerging threat, but my heel caught on something. I stumbled, the flashlight slipping from my grip and spinning away across the floor. In the spinning beam, I caught flashing glimpses of the room turned suddenly to a spinning carousel of nightmare images, distorted shadows, swinging wildly, morphing into grotesque shapes. The flashlight came to rest, the light facing away, leaving me half-blinded in sudden, enveloping darkness. Breath heaving, I groped for it, fingers stretching desperately. As I inched forward, the floorboards under me vibrated, the growl a deafening promise of terror as something hammered from beneath, as if trying to break through the boundary that separated us. Heart slamming against my ribs, I scrambled forward on hands and knees, groping blindly in the dark. My hand finally clasped around the flashlight, and as I swung it up, the light cut across something, a glimpse of something unspeakable, a form wriggling back into the shadows below, its nature undefinable, but its intent unmistakably sinister. Panic surged, propelling me to my feet, driving me toward the staircase. Each step upwards creaked ominously, harmonizing with my pounding heartbeat in a macabre duet. The storm outside howled, the wind's wail mingling with the growl from beneath, and as I ascended, the horrifying realization dawned on me that the lighthouse might not be merely a beacon for lost ships at sea, but also for things far more sinister, far more eager to be found. My hand grasped the cold rail, the other pressed flat against the damp wall. Guided more by feel than sight, my breath came in short, violent bursts, each exhaled plume tasting of salt and old metal. The wind's lament crescendoed, a taunt whirled around the skeletal frame of the lighthouse. A light flickered above, dim and uncertain, as if struggling to assert itself against an oppressive darkness. Halfway up, the staircase pitched unnaturally. A warped step groaned beneath my weight, splintered wood pressing sharp against the sole of my shoe. Panic, now laced with visceral dread, seized me. It wasn't just the innate fear of breaking through the wood and plunging into the abyss below, though that terror was palpable. It was the subtle, yet unmistakable sensation of being watched. The growling had abated, replaced now by a low, rhythmic thumping. Each beat seemed to pulse through the very walls of the lighthouse, synchronizing sickeningly with my own heart. I paused, listening, fighting the urge to flee back down the steps and away from this cursed beacon. But behind me, the darkness seemed even more total, as if the storm had eaten away at the scant light from below, consuming it whole. Forcing myself onward, I reached the top of the stairs, trembling as I pushed open the heavy, metal door to the lantern room. It protested with a screech, revealing a scene bathed in erratic light. The source of the flickering wasn't electrical, it was the flame of the lantern itself, guttering as if choked by an unseen hand. The panoramic glass was streaked with rain, casting warped shadows across the room. My eyes, desperate for any sign of normalcy, were instead drawn to the centerpiece of my fears, the lantern. Something about it was fundamentally wrong. The flame danced, yes, but in hues I hadn't seen fire assume, deep greens and blues that cast more shadow than light. Entering further, the thumping grew louder, more insistent. It was no longer merely in the walls, it was in everything, reverberating through the metal, the glass, and the very air I breathed. The realization hit me, icy and sharp. The beacon wasn't summoning human souls, it was calling to something else, something that understood this sickening pulse. I edged closer to the lantern, my hands outstretched, my fingers trembling. As the colored flames flickered, I thought I saw shapes moving within them, sinuous and swift, vanishing whenever I tried to focus directly on them. A draft, colder than the surrounding storm, brushed against my neck. I spun around, heart clawing its way up my throat. At first, all seemed as it should be, the doorway empty, the staircase silent. But as I turned back to the lantern, I saw it, a smudged handprint on the outside of the glass, larger than any human hand should be. The realization that something had been here, perhaps had climbed the very walls to leave its mark, sent a fresh wave of terror through me. The handprint seemed to absorb the strange light, its edges darker than the surrounding night. Just as I reached out, a folly driven by some inexplicable urge to confirm its reality, the flame surged, a bright, an unnatural blue that illuminated the entire room. And in that ghostly light from below came a new sound, cracking like ice underfoot, advancing up the staircase, deliberate and menacing. My mind raced. The safety of the ground floor seemed an impossible distance away now, the storm outside a lesser threat compared to what climbed toward me. My breath fogged in the air, a ghostly echo of despair, as footsteps became discernible, each one a promise of nightmares made flesh. I backed against the glass, the wide, terrified arcs of my eyes reflecting back at me. The steps ceased momentarily, and in that silence, a far more horrifying sound filled the space. A whisper, not in words, but in a chilling mimicry of my own fraught breathing. Outside, the sea howled its mournful song, indifferent to the terror unfolding within its aged sentinel. And within these walls, I was alone, forgotten, save for the sinister company I now kept. The wind continued to hurl itself against the salt-ridden walls of the lighthouse with spiteful vigor, as if it were trying to penetrate the stone and mortar to reach me. Every gust was a reminder that I was not alone, not truly. The presence that shared the shadow-draped interior with me was growing harder to deny, its essence weaving through the cold drafts that swept through the cramped space. The first of its whispers came from the darkness above, sliding down the spiral staircase like a serpent coiling itself around my spine. The voice was indistinct, a brush of auditory mist against my ears. I stood still, my breath turning to frost before me, each exhalation a stark contrast to the stifling silence that tried to suffocate my senses. "It's only the wind," I murmured to myself, clinging onto the remnants of disbelief. But the lie was thin, flimsy against the backdrop of my escalating dread. I decided to ascend the staircase, each step creaking under my weight as though protesting my intrusion into whatever lay above. As I climbed, the whispers grew louder, or perhaps more insistent. They seemed to speak a name, but it was lost beneath the cacophony of the storm outside. Halfway up, as I brushed my hand against the wall for balance, my fingers grazed something unexpectedly soft, jarringly out of place. I recoiled at the touch, my heart pounding as I withdrew a hand covered in cobwebs that somehow felt like tendrils restraining me. Shaking off the sticky remnants, I tried not to think about the fingers that lingered in the dark, wishing to drag me back down. Reaching the top of the stairs, I came upon the main room of the lighthouse, the source of its once guiding light, now dim and faltering like my resolve. The room was circular, the windows covered in grime and salt, distorting the raging sea into nightmarish swirls. The beacon's light, normally a steadfast pulse, flickered erratically as if gasping for air. In the corner of the room, the old radio equipment lay in disrepair. Wires sprawled out like the innards of some mechanical beast that had long since perished. Driven by a sense of urgency I couldn't explain, I approached it, my hands trembling as I touched the cold metal. The radio crackled to life unexpectedly, filling the room with a harsh static that made my teeth clench. I fiddled with the dials, desperate for any human sound, but the only voices that came through were fragments of distress calls, looping through a litany of storms long past. Among them, a voice broke through, clearer than the others, chilling in its calmness. "Stay away from the light," it warned, before being swallowed up by static once more. Freezing, I stared at the beacon, which flickered like a dying flame. The idea of extinguishing it completely crossed my mind, a desperate thought to perhaps appease whatever haunted this place. But that would mean condemning any passing ships to the merciless rocks awaiting them in the veil of darkness. My resolve wavered, torn between salvation and damnation. As I deliberated, a chilling gust swept through the room, causing the light to sway ominously. I spun around to face the staircase, my pulse spiking. Was it slightly darker below now? The descent of the darkness seemed palpable, as if something was climbing towards me. I should leave, I thought wildly. But even as the decision formed, a scraping sound echoed from below, deliberate, slow, like the drag of heavy, reluctant steps. The lighthouse, confined and isolated as it was, offered nowhere to run but into the arms of the storm outside, or deeper into the enigmatic shadows that now seemed to close in around me. I stepped away from the staircase, my back pressing against the cold glass of a window, watching both the encroaching darkness from below and the haunting beacon above. The wind howled in laughter, and the whispers returned, this time a mournful wail that seemed almost in tune with the sea's raging cries. And at that moment, a wave of realization crashed over me as terror took hold. I was not alone, and I would never be again.